Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub, bringing you another Amonkhet archetype guide. I did one on black-green -1/-1 counters recently, and now I'm doing one on another color pair, blue-black cycling, really is what this color pair is trying to do. Red-white and those aggressive archetypes are sort of seen as the best decks in this format. They're very fast, and I don't think it's incorrect to say that they are the best decks in the format, but I do think other decks can beat it. I tried to show that with the black-green -1/-1 counter deck, and now I'm going to try to show you that with the blue-black cycling deck. And this deck is made up of cycling payoffs and at least 10-ish cards with cycling. So in this video, I'm going to tell you what those the best cycling payoffs are, and I will also tell you how highly I would take the cards with cycling as well. We'll sort of look at a pick order for this particular draft archetype. So let's go ahead and jump into talking about the actual cards. One of the best places to start when thinking about what a particular color pair wants to do in a limited format is by looking at what is called the signpost uncommon. These are two colors. Obviously, they're gold and they represent a certain color pair. They represent what that color pair wants to do in a limited format. And in Amonkhet, that is Shadowstorm Vizier, a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that costs a blue and a black. And whenever you cycle or discard a card, Shadowstorm Vizier gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it sort of has prowess, you could think of it that way, for cycling or discarding cards. And blue and black is the color pair that has the most access to cycling. Almost every color pair has a ton, but blue and black has more than any other, and it has more cycling payoffs than any other color pair as well. So Shadowstorm Vizier is one of these cycling payoffs and is quite good, but I actually think there are two cycling payoffs that come ahead of it for me, and we'll talk about them first. We'll talk about all the different cycling payoffs in blue and black in order of how good I think they are, and then we'll also talk about how good the cards with cycling themselves are. So first, let's talk about the two uncommons that I think are actually better than Shadowstorm Vizier in Amonkhet Limited. And those are Faith of the Devoted and Ruthless Sniper. These are both very powerful build-arounds for Limited. Faith of the Devoted can win the game on its own if you have enough cards with cycling. It just keeps draining your opponent. And it doesn't just do damage to your opponent, you also get to gain life, so it helps you stay alive longer, which is obviously important in this aggressive format. Likewise, Ruthless Sniper is very important if you want to have a very good version of a cycling deck, because this format is so aggressive. Ruthless Sniper can just pick off a lot of the X1s, or at least weaken creatures to the point where they're not hitting you as hard or you can block them more effectively. So Ruthless Sniper and Faith of the Devoted are my two favorite common or uncommon build-arounds for cycling. They're just both very powerful. One of them can be a win condition, and the other one makes it so you don't die to aggro, and that's pretty important in this format. Let's look at the next two cards that I think that are the next best and have a cycling payoff in this format. And those are Horror of the Broken Lands and Pitiless Vizier. Horror of the Broken Lands also has cycling, so that makes it actually trigger all of these other cycling payoffs, which is pretty nice. A 5-mana 4/4 with 1 black to cycle it would be a decent card anyway. I know a 5-mana 4/4 isn't great, but having a card be relevant at two different stages of the game is very interesting. It's a very nice decision-making mechanic, cycling is. Sort of like when I looked at black-green -1/-1 counters, cycling cards are sort of split cards in the same way. But Horror of the Broken Lands also gets a big boost when you cycle things. It becomes a 6/5. Sometimes you can attack into your opponent's board where their best blocker is a 4/4, and they just won't block it, even if you don't have cycling. And that's something to keep in mind with all of these. Even if you don't have a card with cycling in your hand, when you have these things in play, like Ruthless Sniper and Horror of the Broken Lands and Pitiless Vizier, your opponent will play oftentimes like you do, because it's not worth the risk at some stages of the game for them to block your Pitiless Vizier with their 3/3 when you probably or might be able to make him indestructible. Same with Horror of the Broken Lands. He gets to be quite large, and the fact that he also has cycling pushes him up even more in terms of pick order. I do think Shadowstorm Vizier is better than both of these, though, just not as good as the two uncommons, Faith of the Devoted and Ruthless Sniper. So now let's move on to the other two cards that have cycling payoffs. I think these are both playable, but they are to a lesser extent. Heckma Sentinels is a perfectly reasonable card. It's just like an average playable. It's nothing exciting. It's a 3-mana 2/3 who has the same ability that the Vizier does, but it doesn't have flying. But it can cause some of the same problems. You know, if you're attacking into your opponent's 3/3 with it, they're going to be reluctant to block, and so it's nice to get in for a bit of damage. Zenith Seeker has been pretty disappointing for me, and I think basically everyone has been underwhelmed by it. A card that can give other creatures flying you'd think would be quite good, but it turns out it's too fragile, too expensive to cast, and frequently enough, you're not going to have a great creature to give flying in this color pair. I mean, it's not a bad card. I'm not saying that. It is playable in this color pair. I just think basically every other cycling payoff is better. And there's one more cycling payoff to discuss that's an uncommon, and that is Sacred Excavation. Now, this card is an interesting one because you have to have, for most of the cards we're talking about, you have to have like 10 cycling cards in your deck for it to be at its best. And that's true of Sacred Excavation too, but it also matters what the quality of those cards with cycling are. If all you're doing is Sacred Excavation to get back 2 random cards with cycling on, and that's usually what you're getting, and I mean like mediocre cards with cycling that you don't really want to cast, that you just want to cycle, it's not that good. On the other hand, if you have cards like Stir the Sands or Archfiend of Ifnir, it gets to be a little bit better. But most of the time, Sacred Excavation is unplayable. Only in a deck with very, very high power level cards with cycling do I think it's playable. The other problem with it is frequently, even in a heavy cycling deck, it's just going to be a dead card in your hand for a long time because you're not cycling enough cards to really get the value out of it that you need. So that does it for the cycling payoffs in blue-black. Now let's look at the common and uncommon cards with cycling in order of how good I think they are. So at the top, we have these 2 uncommons. Stir the Sands, which is great. If you have to cast it, it gives you 3/2/2 zombie tokens, and that's amazing. It's a first pickable card for any black deck. But it also has cycling, where you can get a zombie into play at instant speed and draw your card from cycling and trigger your cycling payoffs if you have them, and that is very powerful. Stir the Sands is a great card. It's one of the most powerful uncommons in the set, and so is Lay Claim. Lay Claim, not quite as good as Stir the Sands. It has a very, very powerful effect. You can steal planeswalkers or whatever with it. But the reason it's actually playable in this format, despite the format being so aggressive, is that you can cycle it in the early game. If what you really need to do is draw cards, just cycle. It's another card that's not too bad to get back with Sacred Excavation if you had to cycle it in the early game. If you can get it back in the late game, you're going to be able to do some pretty big damage with it. So beneath these 2 sort of top tier uncommons for the cycling deck, after that I have Horror of the Broken Lands, which I included here because he both has cycling and is a cycling payoff, and because of that, that makes him a very, very good card for this deck because he can trigger your cycling payoffs, and he himself is one. And then I have Censor. If you follow my limited content, you know I don't normally like counter spells, but I like Censor. That's because it has 1 blue mana cycling, a very efficient cycling cost, and the bad thing about most counter spells is frequently you'll end up leaving mana up, and then your opponent doesn't play anything that you can counter. And in the case of Censor, that could happen a lot, and that makes it pretty bad. But in this format, if it's in your opening hand, you're almost guaranteed to get to counter something on turn 2 or turn 3, depending on who went first. And if you draw it late, you can just cycle it for 1 blue mana and trigger all your cycling payoffs. And because of those things, I actually like Censor quite a bit. After this, I have Hieroglyphic Illumination and Wasteland Scorpion. The Illumination, you know, they're all like split cards, basically, but Hieroglyphic Illumination feels a lot like one because on one side it's like a 1 blue mana instant that says draw a card, and on the other side it's a 4 mana instant that says draw 2 cards. Both modes are nice. If you're trying to get cycling going, obviously you want to cycle. Wasteland Scorpion is the kind of card with cycling that's also not that bad to get back with Sacred Excavation. Anytime you can get back creatures with Death Touch, it's I'm sure you've had it happen to you. It's a very face-palmy moment because it's just a huge pain. You finally decided to attack into their Wasteland Scorpion with your 3/3 or 4/4. You got rid of it so your 6/6 can survive, but then they get it back with Sacred Excavation, and that is not a lot of fun. And so a lot of the time you don't actually cycle Wasteland Scorpion. It's when I find myself cycling a little less frequently, especially in this aggressive format with like Hooded Brawlers and stuff, because they can play their Hooded Brawler on turn 3, you play your Scorpion on turn 3, and yeah, they can bash in for 5, but you can just trade it with your Wasteland Scorpion, and that makes it better in this format than it would be in a lot of formats. After this, I have Wander in Death and Seeker of Insight. Wander in Death, I think, is just better than Sacred Excavation. It can get you back 2 creature cards for 3 mana, or you can cycle it for 2. And a lot of the creatures you can get back that are going to have cycling anyway if you're really deep into this deck. And so that's something to keep in mind. Seeker of Insight doesn't actually have cycling, but it's a 2 mana 1/3, so it blocks okay early. And anytime you play a non-creature spell, which if you're in this deck, you're going to have a decent number of them, you can draw a card and then discard a card. And the discard part will trigger all of your cycling payoffs. After this, I have Shimmer Scale Drake and Vizier of Tumbling Sands. These, of course, are still all very playable cards. These cards are all cards I'm happy to have in my deck. We haven't really gotten to the point where we're looking at cards that I'm less happy to have in my cycling deck. But Shimmer Scale Drake, 5 mana 3/4 flyer, it can win you the game in the air, and you can also just cycle it if a 3/4 flyer is not doing it for you. Vizier of Tumbling Sands is, I think, much better in the blue-green deck than it is in this deck, even though it has cycling, because the blue-green deck can ramp and has auras it can put on its lands to produce multiple mana already, so it can really ramp you into crazy things. But it has cycling for a reasonable cost, and it does something when it cycles. Untapping a permanent is pretty real. Sometimes you can just be untapping your Shimmer Scale Drake and blocking their 2/2 or whatever, and that's, you know, not bad, but I think it's worse than Shimmer Scale Drake and the rest of the cards we've looked at so far. And now we're getting to the cards that I'm a little less excited to have in my deck. River Serpent, perfectly reasonable. I end up playing them in this deck fairly often. 1 blue mana cycling is very good, and if you're in a cycling deck, he's usually going to be able to attack, but I'm certainly not like, oh boy, I have a River Serpent in my deck. Same for Unburden. I play it in my sideboard more frequently. It's actually kind of nice against people who are playing trials, because oftentimes they can't recast a trial in the same turn, and you can use Unburden to just get rid of it. It's good against control players too. You can cast it and get rid of their best creatures. It is, however, worth noting that if your opponent is in a blue-black cycling deck and you make them discard 2 cards, their cycling payoffs are all going to trigger, and that can sometimes be bad if you don't realize that that's going to happen. After these two, I have Floodwaters and Miasmic Mummy. You know, neither of which that exciting. Floodwaters is just way too clunky in the late game. This format's too fast for a card like Floodwaters, but it does have cycling, making it actually playable and worth playing in this deck if you don't have enough cards with cycling. Whereas, you know, without cycling, it would be completely unplayable. Miasmic Mummy, you know, it's all right. The problem is that in the early game, you don't really want to be discarding cards from your hand that you're not replacing somehow. Miasmic Mummy is okay, but not that great. I've played him a few times when I managed to draft like an Archfiend of Ifnir, who we're going to look at in a minute, and I just needed more discard outlets, and he's great then, but you really have to have a big cycling or discard build around to make Miasmic Mummy worth playing, and I think that's true of Compelling Argument too. This is just a bad card. It's basically always going to be 1 blue mana, draw a card, which isn't terrible, but it's not that, it isn't something you would play unless you get some of the rare or uncommon cycling build-arounds. We talked about the uncommon ones already. Then it becomes pretty good because it's one of the more efficient cyclers in the format. Now, we'll finish up by talking about the rares that are in this color pair. And one of the sort of, I guess, weaknesses of this color pair is that the best cards to build around for it are rare and uncommon. It's very hard to build a version of this deck just filled with commons that's going to be any good. Your Pitiless Viziers and Heckma Sentinels aren't going to do it for you. But if you open up one of the rares we talk about and get some of the uncommons we talked about, it is a very real deck. So here's sort of the first tier of rares. There are 5 different rares that sort of care about cycling and discarding. Archfiend of Ifnir is one of the strongest cards in the entire set. You probably aren't going to get one passed to you unless it's maybe pack 3 and your opponent just has no way of playing black. It's just so strong. Even if you can't cycle or discard things, it's strong. If you can, it gets ridiculous because it puts -1/-1 counters on everything your opponent controls. Drakehaven, though, you can end up getting. It's basically only good in this color pair and only in this deck. I've played it a few times in blue-red and once in blue-white even, but blue-black is where it really shines because you have a ton of cycling synergy and cycling payoffs. And you'll sometimes see them like pick 7 because no one else is in the deck. So Drakehaven is the kind of card that when you see it, it's amazing. It's very worth first picking. I've first picked it and built around it and had it be very strong just because there's so much cycling in the format. It can win you the game single-handedly. It's not quite as good in a vacuum as the Archfiend. And after that, I have Curator of Mysteries, who's probably better than Drakehaven in a vacuum. But it doesn't actually do as much that's exciting with cycling. It's just a 4-mana 4/4, and it lets you scry, which is fine, and itself has cycling if you're desperate, but that's not so good. And then there's a second tier of rares that I think is not that great, and those are New Perspectives and Shadow of the Grave. These two cards can combo together, of course, quite well in Constructed, but in Limited, it's going to be incredibly hard to make it work, even if you get to 10 cards with cycling or whatever. You just have to draw the cards in the right sequence. You have to have Shadow of the Grave in your hand after you cycle about 4 cards for it to be worth it. And with New Perspectives, getting to 7 cards in your hand isn't that easy. It is, making cycling cost 0 is pretty incredible, but it's hard to make that work really well in this format just because it's hard to hold on to 7 cards. And if you had to get to 7 cards, you're holding 4 on turn 6 or whatever, you probably aren't going to be alive after turn 6 in this aggressive format. So that sort of does it for this archetype guide. Basically, what you want to get in this deck are 10 copies of cards that either cycle or discard cards, one of the rare, or at least one of the rare or uncommon build-arounds that we talked about, and then you can have a pretty great deck. And it's a lot of fun to play. It's one of my favorite archetypes in the format. So that does it for this guide. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. If you like the idea of these sort of short archetype guides that I've been doing here on the Aether Hub, let me know in the comments below, and maybe it'll be something I continue to do a little bit of in the future. And if you want to make sure you catch more limited content here on the Aether Hub, you can subscribe. And you can also subscribe to my channel, Nizzahon Magic, where I post lots of limited content as well. And here on the Aether Hub, you can find a lot of other great content too, if you're interested in more than just limited. So, thanks for watching.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the Aether Hub here on YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, support the channel and all our creators by liking, sharing, and of course subscribing so you never miss our latest video. You yourself can become an honorary Hub member by visiting our store at www.aetherhubtcg.com. We have a special pre-order event happening right now where you can snag some of the best deals on packs available. Afterwards, consider visiting our friends over at 5 Color Combo. They have an amazing free app that I use to practice my limited picking skills along with custom art playmats and tokens. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, never be afraid to feed your obsession. I'll see you guys next time.